What's going on? I'm Scott with Koenig, and today we're going to be talking about lug nuts. Specifically, lug nuts that you're going to make a purchase on for the new wheels that you just picked up for your car. So let's get into it. All right, so when it comes down to lug nuts, there's really 5 things that you need to know before you actually begin shopping for lug nuts, and that really has to do with the size, the seat, the style, the material, and the finish of a lug nut. All right, so the first thing we're gonna be talking about is size. Now, size matters here. Your vehicle has a unique size that works for that application, and that's the type of lug nut or lug bolt that you need to replace it with. So look for those numbers. Those numbers may look something like 14 mm by 1.5. What that means is it's 14 millimeters in the diameter of the thickness of the lug nut, and then it's gonna be a 1.5 millimeter thread pitch. Now, lug bolt, lug nut, doesn't matter. Your vehicle needs to use whatever it came with from the factory, so go ahead and make sure that you look that information up, ask a wheel and tire professional, and make sure that you have the right information before you begin your purchase. So the next piece that you need to know is the seat type. That's right, seat type. Now, a seat type is basically what's found at the base of a lug nut, and there are going to be kind of 3 distinct majority different types of seats.
So there actually are a couple different applications in industry. You see cone seat, you see radius seat, and you see a lot of different flat seat applications. And ultimately, it really comes down to brand preference. So a lot of the OEMs have their own preference for those, and it's based on their historical design standards. They all have their own different methodologies behind how to really get the most tension in a wheel stud. Now, what it really does mean though is you can't mix and match. If you have cone seat fasteners, you need cone seat wheels, and vice versa. So for example, if all of the accessory wheels you're purchasing are cone seat, you need cone seat fasteners.
Cone, ball, or flat are going to be the type of seats that you're going to potentially have on your vehicle. All right, so when it comes down to lug style, what we're talking about is something like an acorn, a spline drive, or a tuner diameter. And essentially what these are is essentially the shape of the lug nut. It also usually refers to some sort of indication of the socket that you would need to use to be able to secure the fastener to the vehicle, or potentially kind of the diameter of that hardware. So with the diameter of the hardware, where this becomes important, especially when tuner diameter or even tuner diameter spline drive, where these make most sense is where you're gonna have an aftermarket wheel that may be either dual drilled or have a smaller lug hole than maybe some of your standard sockets. This allows you to use a thin wall socket or to be able to have a little bit more room so that when you secure the fastener to the wheel, you're not scratching the lug hole of your aftermarket wheel. Tuner diameter, again, it's going to make it smaller, and that allows a little bit more access to be able to put a socket in there and properly tighten the fastener. You'll hear things like open-ended or close-ended lug nuts, and really what that means is an open-ended lug nut essentially allows the stud to essentially pass through the head of the fastener. Now, the reason this could be important, let's say you have a vehicle that you're using on track, or you put extended studs on for some reason, and you need to be able to have a lug nut that could properly fasten the wheel, but also allow the stud to protrude past it. This may be an option for you. The next thing is closed lug nuts. Well, there's gonna be a very finite point where you're not gonna be able to put a fastener in as much, so you don't want that to bottom out. But most of the lugs that you'll see out there on the road, they're gonna be closed-ended lug nuts. And those are because it will keep a lot of the rust and different things like the environment that gets into an open-ended lug nut. It will keep it from getting in there, usually keeps that stud protected even more. But let's talk about some of the more mandatory things like a mag shank or an ET lug. Now, these are sometimes used by wheel and tire professionals to gain some thread engagement, in which case it's not optional anymore. So you gotta make sure the wheel's properly drilled for that, meaning that the hole of the wheel at the mounting pad is actually big enough to be able to receive an ET lug, but in a lot of cases it will be. And if you need that, like for some of the cars that have shorter studs, maybe some of the Hondas or the Toyotas, they may use an ET or mag shank lug nut to be able to get extra thread engagement. This is one of those times you're gonna wanna use a wheel and tire professional to properly guide you on which hardware set you need for your vehicle to properly secure your wheel to the vehicle. If you have any questions about why you might wanna do this or what thread engagement is, we've done a video on it. You can go watch all about it. Okay, so now let's move into material. There are a few materials out there that people have been known to make lug nuts of. Aluminum, forged aluminum, steel, forged steel. You'll hear titanium. Look, here's the thing to understand. These are gonna come in at different price points and different use cases. I think one of the things that you should consider when you're choosing a material is your use. For example, a race guy may want the lightest lugs possible and may be willing to spend more money to get that. Titanium might be a good example for this. It's extremely strong, it's also extremely expensive. May not be something you need for your daily driver. But if you're gonna use, like I say, a steel lug nut, that is something that should last a long time and have the ability to hold up to multiple cycles of use. And that's something that you're probably gonna be looking for. Whereas aluminum, even forged aluminum lug nuts, they're gonna have a slightly lower cycle count on how many times they can be used before they start to distort, warp, or start to strip. In which case the lug nut needs to be disregarded and needs to get out of there. Okay, so moving on to the last consideration here, and that has to do with finish. There are different finishes you will see out there. Luckily, for your options out there, there are a lot of different vanity type of lugs that may come in totally different types of finishes. Different colors across the board, some that are anodized, some that are powder coated. You may find the ones that are in black, maybe you want them in chrome, maybe you want them in some sort of special brushed nickel, bronze. Again, they're all out there. Some of that neochrome stuff that you see with all the different titanium looking stuff. Again, they're just options and you should think about them before you go to make your purchase. Okay, so before we close out here, let me give you a few tips and tricks that you may or may not know when it comes down to fastening the hardware on your vehicle. Things like always use a torque wrench. Now, it's one thing when you're buzzing lug nuts off or lug bolts, but when you're gonna be putting them on, you wanna make sure that you properly set the torque to your vehicle's manufacturer recommendations based on a torque wrench. You're gonna wanna make sure that you use that torque wrench, properly set it, make sure it's in good working order, and make sure that your lugs are fastened in the correct pattern. And if you don't know what that means, look it up. Plenty of information out there. Again, 5 lug patterns typically are a star. There's a pattern for 6 lug, 8 lug, etc. Make sure you're using the right pattern. Make sure you're securing them with a torque wrench so you properly know that they are fastened to spec. So that's pretty much it for this one. Thank you from Nathan from McGard for coming on and kind of giving us his 2 cents on the lug nut thing, and we will catch you in the next one.